Well, thanks very much, Michael. I'm surprised my mother wasn't invited today because she'd be the only one who believed all of that. But Michael is a very valued colleague and friend. He is somebody who has hit the ground running. Not only did he win a seat off the Labor Party, it's easier for someone like me to make my way into Parliament with a relatively safe seat like Kooyong. But to take a seat off the Labor Party, that's how we get back into government. And you led the way, Michael, with that. And you bring to the party something which is obviously missing on the other side of politics, and that's deep experience in the private sector, in tax and in law. And you campaigned really well, and I had the privilege of going out to your campaign launch, and the Prime Minister was there, and he was waxing lyrical about the great attributes and qualities of Michael Sukkar, until one little hiccup when he got up in front of everybody and he said, "That Michael Sukkar, he's a great suppository of wisdom." Well, Michael, we know you're also a good repository of wisdom as well. To John Roscombe and Hugh Tobin and your team at the IPA, congratulations on ensuring that the IPA is at the forefront of national debate. You really do steal the resolve of MPs, and you shine a light into dark places which sometimes politicians don't have the courage to bring to the public for, because we know reform is hard. That's why not every government does reform. But you put those issues on the agenda. You're a clarion call for good policy. And while there are some controversial positions you take, I think that's what your 4,000 members expect of you. And you in particular, John, have been an incredible driver of reform on the national stage, advocacy through our media, but also the leadership within your own organisation. So you should really take a bow. Thank you very much, John. To Rod Kemp and Michael Kroger and the other distinguished members of the board, Rod, as you know, was the Assistant Treasurer of the Commonwealth, and as I was coming in here this morning, he said, "Look, Josh, do you think it's too late for me to make a comeback?" Yes, Rod, it is. There's no room on the Senate ticket. But also, can I point out that the IPA has incredible depth among its staff. I mean, you don't open up the papers any day and to see an empty page, you see the names of Julie Novak there. And you see the names of Chris Berg and Richard Alsop and Simon Breeny and James Patterson. And this morning I opened up the Australian Financial Review, and then I saw a terrific article by Alan Moran on deregulation. Not because his opening line said that Josh Frydenberg was energetic, but because he ended with a quote from Zhou Enlai, a communist Chinese leader, and I thought, that's a first for the IPA. Can I also acknowledge Tim Wilson, Tim and Mike Nahan in Western Australia, two great products of the IPA who are making their own major contributions now on the national stage. And I think that's very important because one thing you see in the United States political system, because they don't have the notion of responsible government as we do, that we take from the Westminster system, is they have great people who go from organisations such as this, whether it's the Brookings or Heritage Foundation, straight into Assistant Secretaries of State or Deputy Secretaries of State or whatever the case may be. We don't have that system here. So to see top people from organisations such as the IPA go into senior positions like Tim has done within government, but not as a politician, I think that's to be applauded, because positions such as the one that Tim is fulfilling now do have an important role in their public advocacy, in shaping policy. So I would encourage more of that from the IPA, and I think certainly from the Abbott government you will find a very sympathetic voice. Well, as I stand here today, I am also reminded of the history of the IPA. and the fact that since 1943 you've been talking about liberty and freedom. And Charles Kemp, founder of the IPA, is often not remembered for the important role that he had in shaping Sir Robert Menzies' thinking. And in fact, Paul Kelly, in his book The End of Certainty, says that Charles Kemp is probably the principal architect of Menzies' political reforms and political platform. And so to come here today and to talk about deregulation in the context of what John referred to as the moral case for deregulation, as the freedoms case for deregulation, as individual liberties case for deregulation, I think it's a wonderful privilege for me, so thank you for the invitation. The Abbott government has been in office just over 6 months, but has a very busy and hectic economic agenda. First and foremost, we announced a Commission of Audit to be chaired by the head of the BCA, Tony Shepherd. This was the first Commission of Audit since Bob Officer's Commission of Audit in 1996. It's not only significant because it's looking right across the government sector, but it's significant because it put a senior business leader in Tony Shepherd at the centre of that process, which sent out a message that we as a new government will put business at the centre of our thinking and our decision making. We've appointed David Murray to conduct the first financial systems inquiry since Wallace in 1997. And that's extremely important because the financial system is not only vital in terms of stability, but there is incredible opportunity in our region as nearly 3 billion people move into the middle class in the Asia Pacific over the next 20 years. And Australia has $1.3 trillion within our superannuation funds. We have a great opportunity to capitalise if we can get efficiencies in our financial system. We're undertaking a root and branch review of competition policy. As a local member like Michael, one of the concerns I hear from small business, and there are more than 2 million small businesses around Australia, is about the power of duopolies and oligopolies and monopolies. And so we need to have a good hard look at what we need to do around competition policy. We're serious about tackling lawlessness in the industrial relations space. We've announced a Royal Commission into financial mismanagement among the unions. We're committed to restoring the Australian Building and Construction Commission. It should never be forgotten that the ABCC came out of a Royal Commission, the Coal Royal Commission. And in 2004, before the ABCC was in place, for every 1,000 employees, there were 224 days lost a year due to industrial disputation. But after the implementation of the ABCC by 2006, that 224 had dropped to just 24. And so in Victoria, where 10% of people are employed in the construction and building space, we really need to do something in this area. And so that's also a very important area for reform. Tax, we're going to have a white paper into tax reform, because not only do we need to get rid of the carbon tax and the mining tax and to reduce company tax, but we have to understand that currently in Australia there are 125 taxes. But 115 of those taxes produce just 10% of the revenue. 10 taxes in Australia produce 90% of the revenue. So we're clearly overtaxed, but also there's too much complexity in our tax system. And so that's another area where we need to look at. But there's no more important area of microeconomic reform than deregulation. And deregulation goes right to the heart of the productivity agenda, because in Australia, we do have a productivity problem. Multi-factor productivity has fallen by nearly 3% in the 5 years from mid-2007. The Economist's Intelligence Unit surveyed 51 countries for productivity growth and found that Australia came second last, just ahead of Botswana. And when it comes to the overall regulatory burden, the World Economic Forum weighed up the performance of 148 countries and found that out of 148 countries, Australia came a sad 128th in terms of the regulatory burden. And as Michael mentioned, the Labor Party left us with 21,000 additional regulations. This is despite Kevin Rudd going to the elections saying he would have a one in, one out policy. And the problem with the Labor Party is that their default position was to re-regulate rather than to deregulate. And that has really been a drag on our productivity. In fact, we have in place still, the concept of regulatory impact statements, where you need to do a deep dive within the bureaucracy before you implement a regulation to establish what is the cost, what is the impact on compliance, what is the impact on new entrants, what is the impact on productivity. Is there another alternative to regulation? What level of consultation has taken place? This is all the role of regulatory impact statements that need to be conducted before you introduce new regulation. But during the time of the Labor government, all their major policy initiatives, the carbon tax, the mining tax, the changes to Fair Work, the NBN, the changes to the future of financial advice, they were all exempted by the Prime Minister, whether it was Rudd or Gillard, from the regulatory impact statement process. As I go around the country and talk about regulation among small businesses, among the not-for-profit sector, 5 key issues are raised with me that will be the focus of my work and the government's work in the area of deregulation. Firstly, it's tackling the volume of regulation. In Australia, there's just too much regulation, and as we've seen, it's increased incrementally. And may I say, the IPA has done some very good work in measuring the net increases in regulation over successive years. The second area where we need to tackle over-regulation is the duplication that exists between state and federal governments, and also between competing federal agencies. I'll give you an example in the environmental approval space. The BCA documented one company that wanted to make $1 billion investment in Queensland in the resource space. It sought an environmental approval. The process took more than 2 years. It cost the company more than $20 million. It required 4,000 meetings, a 12,000-page report, and when the approval came back, it had 1,500 conditions attached, 300 at the federal level, 1,200 at the state level, and 8,000 sub-conditions. Now, how as a country can we expect companies where capital is mobile, where business is not sentimental, to invest in our country when we are not the only producers of iron ore, we are not the only producers of coal, we are not the only producers of uranium or oil and gas. We are competing in a competitive international environment. So what we have said is we need one-stop shops. We need to delegate some of our responsibility at the federal level down to the state level to speed up the process. Because we don't want a situation like Incitec Pivot, a top 50 Australian company recently experienced, where the CEO, James Fazzino, said to me, he said, "Josh, we wanted to build as a company an $850 million chemical plant in Louisiana, USA, and an $850 million chemical plant in Newcastle, New South Wales. Within 6 months in Louisiana, he got the phone call from the governor of that state, Bobby Jindal, who rang him up and said, "What can we do to help you?" And the approval was approved, the process was approved, and the building is now up and running. In Newcastle, more than 2 years has passed. The approval hasn't been granted, so the company at a board level has taken the decision not to proceed with that $800 million investment. That is what is happening right around this country. And that is jobs foregone, jobs that you will never ever see again. So we are very much focused on that level of duplication. The third problem that I've identified in terms of the deregulation agenda relates to the level of consultation with key stakeholders, businesses and the not-for-profit sector. Often they are the last to know about a new regulation. They are not consulted previously, and if they are, it's not a genuine consultation. It's more of a negotiation. Here is what we are going to do. Let's tinker around the edges. So we have said we need genuine consultation well in advance, where we need to identify what is the problem we are trying to solve. Is government action necessary? And if it is so, is it the means of last resort using the regulation which is the most beneficial? We have to ask these questions and engage in proper consultation with those who are most impacted by new regulation. A fourth issue relates to post-implementation reviews and ensuring that regulations don't stay on the statute books long after their use-by date. So we have said as a government we will have mandatory post-implementation reviews within 5 years of bringing in a new regulation to see if it's having the effect that it was determined to have in the first place, and if not, to abolish it, and if it is, then to renew it. And we want greater use of sunset clauses, because too often thousands and thousands of regulations stifling productivity, hurting investment and innovation, and deterring the creation of new jobs are staying on the statute books for too long. A fifth and final area for our focus in terms of the deregulation agenda relates to the role of the regulators. It's one thing to focus on the amount of regulation that's on the statute books. It's another thing to deal with the regulators who are responsible for administering that regulation. The Commonwealth today has 75 different external regulators and 68 internal regulators. Some of them are big, like the ATO with more than 20,000 staff, and some of them are small, like the Department of Parks. But they all perform an important role in the administration of regulation. So what we have said is we will task as a government, and we released it on Wednesday, we will task the Productivity Commission to come up with a framework for auditing the performance of those regulators as they go about administering their functions. Because so often I hear feedback, I get the feedback that the regulators are growing in size, there's mission creep, and they're becoming increasingly risk averse. And so they don't want another storm financial collapse, but neither do we. But they are going too far down the path of intervention, enforcement, compliance, without understanding what is the true impact on the stakeholders that they are affecting. And when these regulators adopt a cost recovery model, it's often industry who pays the price for the regulator's risk aversion. And that is increasingly the case. So what we are looking at in auditing the performance of these roles, the role of these regulators, is are they encouraging, where appropriate, self-regulation? Do they distinguish within their organisation between the role of advice and licensing, for example, from the role within the regulator of enforcement, which would be consistent with good governance to distinguish out those roles? What sort of relationship do these regulators have with the stakeholders and the businesses that they are affecting? Do they put out information about the regulations that they're introducing before that regulation takes effect to give some guidance, or do they wait till after that regulation has taken effect, which is often too late for those businesses that are most affected? So we are very much focusing on the role of the regulators, and each minister who has a regulator within their portfolio is sending for the first time a letter of expectation out to the head of the regulator to say this is the government's emphasis on deregulation. We want you to, where appropriate, use random audits as opposed to mandatory requirements for information. And we want you to bear in mind what is the true cost to the companies that are your stakeholders of your decisions about regulation. So we took to the election a whole series of reforms to try to deal with those 5 issues. The first was we set ourselves a headline target, which is an annual net number of cutting red and green tape by $1 billion. Now, this is the compliance cost. $1 billion is the compliance cost, the cost of a new computer system that a company may have to deploy just to meet a new regulation, the cost of new staff that they may have to hire to fill out forms, and the paperwork generally that mounts up on their desk. That is the cost of compliance. But I can tell you that if we get to $1 billion in a cost saving in terms of compliance, the net economic impact for the economy will be exponentially bigger than that. Because, for example, an environmental approval, if you have a one-stop shop, that may save the industry $50 or $60 million in terms of their compliance costs. But it may mean there's a 2-year less delay in the approval of an investment. So that investment then goes ahead worth billions of dollars that may otherwise not have gone ahead. So the net exponential benefit to the economy is significantly greater than just the compliance savings, which we are independently measuring with the Office of Best Practice Regulation. The second major reform that we took to the election, which we are implementing now, is that the Prime Minister himself has taken responsibility for this agenda. Traditionally, the Office of Best Practice Regulation, which measures the cost of compliance, and the Deregulation Unit have been housed within the Department of Finance, and the Minister for Finance has had the responsibility for deregulation. Well, the Prime Minister has said from now on, the Office of Best Practice Regulation and the Deregulation Unit will be housed in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and his Parliamentary Secretary, myself, will be responsible for pushing this agenda, reporting directly up to him. And the Prime Minister has made very clear to me that if I hit any obstacles with ministers, to take it directly to him, because then he can help move that process along. And that is extremely important. The third major change is we have said to ministers, you have to set up deregulation units within your own departments. So housed within their own department is an existing public servant who's got a responsibility for doing an audit of that whole department's regulations that they are responsible for. And that is being done over the next 12 months and working with an advisory committee which involves pulling people from outside the public, from outside the pool of government, from the private sector and the not-for-profit organisation, bringing those people in on advisory committees to give advice to the Minister which areas of regulation can we actually cut. Incentives. Currently, the incentives are the wrong way around. Public servants have an incentive to try to eliminate risk. They don't have an incentive to reduce red tape. And if we're going to make a headway in this cultural change, it's going to be about getting a better balance between risk and cost. And so changing these incentives for the public servants is vitally important. As I mentioned, we've got letters of expectation and the Productivity Commission report into the role of the regulators. That's extremely important. The other thing that we've done is we've set aside 2 days a year for repealing unnecessary and redundant regulations. And the first repeal day in the history of the Commonwealth will be next Wednesday, which will be called Repeal Day. It's a concept taken from the United States Congress, where they have a thing called the corrections calendar. And why it's important is it's focusing the minds of politicians on this need to cut red and green tape. So as is the practice, you introduce the legislation a week before you debate it. So last Wednesday, a couple of days ago, we introduced 12 bills into the Parliament which were designed across a range of portfolios to cut regulation. And those cuts have been estimated by the Office of Best Practice Regulation and individual departments of the Commonwealth to measure $720 million worth of savings. Together they will get rid of more than 50,000 pages from the statute books, more than 1,000 redundant acts, including acts that go back to 1904 that make the provision for state navies. Given that the Federal Navy came into effect in 1913, we no longer need that 1904 Act. It's also getting rid of more than 9,500 redundant regulations. Regulations that make for a prescription in pennies and pounds, and regulations that have stayed on the statute books for way too long. So we are very proud of what we have been able to do in just over 6 months. Another significant change that will avoid duplication between states is our announced opening up of the Comcare scheme. Comcare is the Commonwealth scheme which Labor put a moratorium on as soon as it came to government in 2007. And traditionally, companies had to participate in separate workers' compensation schemes in every state. So when you are a big company like a Woolworths operating across state boundaries, you had to spend millions of dollars in additional compliance cooperating with systems in New South Wales, which is different to the system in Victoria. And there was only one exemption, which was if you were a company that was competing against a government-owned entity or a former government-owned entity. So if you were DHL competing against Australia Post, you were able, therefore, to enter into the Comcare scheme. We have got rid of that limitation and said that any company operating across state boundaries can enter into the Comcare scheme. That will save more than $30 million each and every year to industry. Likewise with offshore petroleum approvals. Currently, you have to get approval from one federal agency called NOPSEMA and another federal agency, namely the Environment Department. We have said we will only go through one process, which is going to be through NOPSEMA, which runs through the Department of Industry, not the Department of Environment, and that will save $120 million every year. And the head of the Australian Petroleum and Exploration and Production Association, David Byers, said that is the best way to capture the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of investment that is waiting to come to Australia. So that's just some of the changes we're doing to remove the duplication. The other second theme of the initiatives that we've undertaken are around streamlining existing burdensome compliance requirements. The future of financial advice is one good example. Labor's FOFA laws had a $700 million implementation bill and an annual $375 million compliance cost. Now, we should understand that we need to protect the consumer, but just because Labor came up with it doesn't mean it's right. And we've said that we want to get that balance right again between risk and cost, and with some certain changes we can reduce compliance bill by upwards of $190 million each and every year on the industry, which means that is money saved for consumers, because the industry would obviously pass that on to consumers. The Personal Property and Security Act is another good example where we're streamlining existing compliance requirements. Currently, if you are a hire firm, a mum and dad hire firm that rents out scissor lifts or whacker packers to make roads or other pieces of equipment, you have to pay $8 and register every piece of that equipment with a Commonwealth agency. We have said that is absolutely ridiculous and it is driving up the costs and compliance burdens on small businesses, so we're eliminating those sort of requirements. The not-for-profit sector is another area which will benefit greatly from our deregulation push. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence currently running a $100 million educational program for the federal government called Hippie, which provides disadvantaged families with support to help get their kids to school. Would you believe that the Brotherhood of St Lawrence cannot send a piece of paper out to these contracted parties without getting it ticked off by the federal government? It has to report to the Federal Education Department in detail every month. So we have said, no longer will you have to do that. You can now report to the federal government on a quarterly basis. That will save the Brotherhood of St Lawrence more than $500,000 a year to get on with doing the business of helping those in need. And third and finally, in terms of the key themes, it's about getting rid of just silly regulation that doesn't pass the pub test. For example, why when you are importing into Australia a movie that comes in 2D, 3D, DVD, in Blu-ray, why do you have to get 4 separate classifications at a cost of thousands of dollars? And so the movie that we've cited a number of times over the past few days has been Kung Fu Panda, because currently that requires 4 different classifications. So we've said you will now go to just one classification, and that will save thousands of dollars. Why should a job service provider have to keep paper copies of every job application, so that one job service provider told us that they have 336 cabinets full of job applications? When they're all stored electronically online, that should be sufficient. And why should a farmer that is exporting potatoes to Korea have to get and pay for a certificate of origin for every shipment that they're sending over, when they could be able to self-certify their own shipments as a produce of Australia? They are just some of the many changes that we are introducing. Finally, I just want to say that this goes to the heart of reducing productivity and compliance. If we can actually reduce the amount of red tape, we will lift growth in this country and obviously create thousands of new jobs. It goes to the heart of our liberty agenda. One of the great quotes is from Ronald Reagan, who said the 10 most dangerous words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." Well, can I say that when it comes to regulation, government has wrongly believed it is trying to help you. And I have never found a stakeholder that won't defend an existing piece of regulation as being in the best interest of the environment, or the best interest of the consumer, or the best interest of the worker. But what we are on about is getting a paradigm shift, a cultural change in how the bureaucracy, in how the ministers, and how the Parliament thinks about regulation. This is not a 6-month or 6-year project. This is a 10, a 15, a 20-year project which involves undoing the damage that has been done by previous governments. This is about putting in place processes that will be adopted by successive governments, whatever their political persuasion. Back in 1946, Sir Robert Menzies' Liberal Party put an advertisement in the bulletin, and it had a picture of a husband and a wife sitting at a table drowning in a sea of paperwork. And the headline was, "We want less forms, more reforms." This is not a new message. This is a message that previous governments have talked about year upon year at state and federal level, Liberal and Labor. But the message I want to leave with you today is that the Prime Minister, his Cabinet and his members of Parliament are absolutely determined to see a sea change in the government's approach to regulation, to cut $1 billion a year and to put the processes in place that will be taken up well into the future. We need your support. We are very fortunate to have the IPA stand side by side with us. It's an important area of reform and we are determined to do it right. Thank you very much.